Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Lights on Data show. Today, we're going to talk about scaling a startup's data team.
Awesome. Our wonderful guest today is Pedram Navid. He is the head of data engineering and DevRel at Dagster Labs. Previously, the head of data at HighTouch. And he also worked as both a data engineer and a data scientist at small startups and large banks. When he's not causing trouble online, he's out bird watching. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. It's actually
Welcome,
pretty old.
Pedro.
I have
Welcome,
no
Pedro.
time for bird watching, but I used to.
So do you know birds and you're well versed in species of birds?
I'm getting there. It all started last year when I was a consultant. I was in between jobs, and as a consultant, I had a lot more free time. So I was in my backyard a lot. I noticed birds. I started Googling what they were. And then one thing led to another. I bought binoculars. I started going on bird walks, and middle of the day is the perfect time to go see birds. Also the right time to be working. So it's fun. And then I got a real job, and now I watch them when I can every now and then, but it's not the same.
Seems like a very calming activity, like a very meditative way of spending your time.
I think it
I've
depends on your
never-
personality.
Yeah.
So for some people, I think it is. And then other people, they're like very much like, I want to go see as many birds as possible. And they have a checklist and they want to get the numbers. That's not me, but I've seen those people. They don't look relaxed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
I think I need some lessons from you. I would be that person. Okay, how many did I see today? Can I go now home?
Yeah. It's like as a data engineer, I would think that maybe you, like how you're creating a data pipeline and engineering all of that, you're planning everything like where we're gonna, that's the path that we're gonna take to catch the most, or go with the flow.
The nice thing about bird watching is none of your plans are ever held true.
Yeah.
And it's the opposite of work. And so I try to keep it like, I'm not big on like collecting my data and like analyzing it or anything like that.
Yeah,
Surprisingly, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to do it digitally. I'm very like offline about it just to get away from the work stuff. And I enjoy it that way.
Yeah.
But it's nice. It's a fun hobby. It also helps you relax, and it teaches you how to just like be in the moment. Sometimes it's hard to do that during work time, but the birds don't really care what your plans are. They'll be there or they won't, and you have to go with the flow. If you're observant, you'll see something new, and even if you don't, you might see something old in a new light, which is nice.
So life lessons and quotes. I think we can
this
start
into a bird
now.
podcast, not a data podcast.
So, Pedram, along the flow of your career in data engineering, data science, from startups and large banks as well, and quite the diversity there. How have these experiences really shaped your approach to scaling data teams, particularly in the context of startups?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when I first joined a startup, I really didn't know what I was doing, and you're forced to scale a data team just out of pure like need, and you learn really quickly that way. I think what I was really thankful for is I did have experience at the bank where I saw both the good and bad of having like structure and organization. Sometimes too far turns into bureaucracy and no movement. But there are certain things that happen at these larger organizations that I think are useful. The way they approach data, the way they approach asking questions, strategy sessions, thinking about holistically what they want to do and achieve over the coming quarter or year. That type of stuff, I think, is still very useful even at a small startup. Maybe you don't have as much like decision-making bureaucracy around it, but I think there's still a pattern there that I was able to build off on. So when I moved to startups, like I brought some of that with me, right? Like maybe earlier than most startups tend to do it. It really depends, I think, on like the background of the founders. Like some founders, they've really been and appreciated that data mindset, and so they're very heavily focused on that. But I've also been at startups where they're not really well versed in like what data actually can do for them. And so a lot of it has been like teaching, here's why we do these things, and here's why this might be useful, and this might not be that useful to do.
In a startup, you do have resource constraints in any job, and no matter how big the organization is, there are some constraints there, but even more so in a startup company where you really need to focus on scaling up the business. And how how the evolving technologies, you have to set something, but you also need to be nimble to the change, especially if the startup's focus might also change along the way. What are some of those key challenges that you've encountered in this process?
It is very true that it's resource constrained, but I also really love resource constraints because they help narrow focus and make it very easy to prioritize. I think when you have too many resources, you can do everything, and then it's just like a mess, and you're not really sure where the value is.
Right.
I find when you're resource constrained, you have no choice but to prioritize heavily, which is a
Mhm.
really powerful thing to learn. And I think most data people are not very good at it. They tend to be people pleasers. They don't like saying no. They want to do everything for
Mhm.
everyone. And when you have one data person and it's you have no choice but to learn to use that skill to make sure you're saying no probably 80% of the time to what people want, but using that no as a way to learn, like, hey, here are the things people are asking for. What are ways that I can do to unblock them, but not to answer like this one specific question, but is there a pattern here where I can build some type of self-servability for them to go get the answers themselves and really take my limited time and make it as maximally efficient as possible. That's, I think, probably the biggest, I think, power of a resource constraint is giving you that laser focus and the ability to say no. And I've
Mhm.
even found as you've grown
Yeah,
the team,
totally.
like you don't really change. Like it doesn't change. It's just like you say no, maybe to fewer things, but you still have that mindset of like we can't do everything. Whereas if you came from it a different angle, you might be inclined to say yes to everything because you are on a team of like 7 or 8 people, and it's not clear that anything is more important than the other.
Mhm.
Yes. So, based on your experience, what would be the essential roles and skill sets that should be part of a good and effective data team, especially at the early stages of a startup?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the ability and willingness, like a demonstrated ability and willingness to learn, is the one thing I always look for when I'm hiring.
I love it.
Because there's nothing I don't expect anyone to know everything. I didn't know everything when I started, but I saw that a challenge, like, there's two ways to look at it. One is like, oh, I'm not qualified for this. I don't know how to do this. Or the other one is like, I'm not qualified for this. I don't know how to do this, but I'll figure it out. That extra step really, I think, makes a difference in anyone's career and in the people I've ever hired. It's not easy, I think, but it is always a solvable problem. There's nothing typically, there's always exceptions, but like we're not doing like cutting edge research usually in data. We're trying to count numbers, and sometimes it's hard to know how to count them, but that's okay. Like you can figure it out. So for me, if you're willing, curious, able to learn, like that is probably more important than any other skill set I can think of, to be honest.
And Pedram is then you're looking for people that can do multiple tasks and have different roles interchangeably. And just like you said, as long as they're willing to learn, maybe the path of learning is not so clear in the beginning, but it's just evolving and depends on multiple
Yeah,
factors.
I think so. I think it depends. Like, so for if you're hiring like your first data person, you definitely want some experience. Like, just putting someone brand new in that role is just not going to work.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yep.
Now, you can probably get away with hiring someone with a little bit of experience who you think can grow into the role, especially at a startup. That's the pitch of the whole thing. Outside of like curiosity and willingness to learn, I think getting someone who cares about business context and like will actually look at the data is really useful. I've seen some data engineers, for example, who love to build the pipeline but don't like to look at the numbers behind the
Mm-hmm.
pipeline. And so they'll ship something without even actually looking at the data to know, does it make sense? Is it correct? It's just like an architectural thing for them. That's not going to work. You need someone who's going to have business context. They're going to dive in. There's no separation between the data engineering and the business analysis. Like it's all going to be one thing. So having that curiosity, I think, is also super useful.
Mm-hmm. And so in the early stages of the startups, would you have a data engineer role that's separate from a data scientist role?
In the early stages, I would have someone to lead the data function first. It can be like a senior data engineer. I think that's also fine.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I would go straight to analyst. I've seen people hire analysts and the analyst is stuck because they don't have the data they need.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have to become a data engineer. And if that's not a skill they have, then that's really not they're not going to be set up for success. So I think you need a data engineer first, or some type of head of data role, someone who's going to be able to set up the infrastructure, the foundations, work with stakeholders, figure out what the needs are. All that stuff is that's really the bulk of the work, I think, in the early stages. And even figuring out who to align with. Like you have, product, marketing, sales, CEO, finance. You got to pick one. Find someone who's really motivated by that problem, who can solve that. Once the data is flowing, and I think you'll start to feel soon hey, we have some data, we have a backlog of requests that we can't answer. Now you can bring in an analyst, a data scientist, someone to start to solve the backlog problem. But in the early days, you don't have a backlog problem. You have an input problem. The data's not there, right? So you have to hire for that role. And you have to hire someone who is willing to understand the business context as they build that stuff, because you can't build it in a vacuum.
And as you're scaling up, where do you put in more resources? Is it with the data scientists?
Yeah, I think so. Data scientist, data analysis, analytics engineer, it depends on what you want to call them. But I think, you start with your data engineer, you build out that, and then you start to get people who are much more motivated by answering questions, right? Taking the data, massaging it in a way that makes sense, working with the business users to answer questions, present them with whatever reports or dashboards they need to solve that problem as well. That's probably where the bulk of the work will happen. There's two ways to think about it. One is we're going to have a central data team who's going to serve the entire org. But sometimes it makes sense to just have marketing get their own marketing analyst, and sales to get their own sales analyst. And then the central team just supports those people instead, because marketing is very specific, and having enough context on how to do attribution and ads and how all this stuff works can be very different than sales, and it's very different than product. And so it really depends on the needs of the org, but it can be sometimes helpful to get someone who's really good at events for the product side, and someone who's really good at marketing attribution for the marketing side, rather than trying to have one person on data team do all 5 functions. That can be really tough. I think the central model is really tough to make work well across all the departments. But if you wanted an initial hire to help build the core foundations, how many customers do we have, how many signups do we have, that stuff is probably fine. But I think you'll find very soon that one person is not going to be able to scale efficiently in all directions.
And as you're scaling up even further, as you're having these centralized, decentralized data scientists, do you find you start building this center of excellence that's putting together the guidelines and their best practices and their hub of knowledge that the data scientists connect with?
Probably not at most startups. I think center of excellence is probably a little bit too heavy. You definitely want a platform team at some point who builds the data platform, essentially, right? They have oversight onto the data warehouse, the data orchestrator. They have opinions on how to build observability and logging and all this foundational stuff that should be the same across business functions. That should be a really strong team that's really motivated by making those people really successful. When I was working as a data engineer, I had a data scientist next to me, and they were newer, so they didn't know all the ways to deploy models into production, for example. And so I was really motivated by making it easier for him to do his job, because a data scientist, they shouldn't really need to know that much about deploying models to production. What they're really good at is building the models, making sure they're good. And the more time they can spend on doing that, the better it is for the entire org. And the less time I have to do that, because I don't actually enjoy it that much. Building a platform, getting direct feedback from these people. What are your pain points? Where do you find it difficult? Okay, let me solve this globally. And now it benefits you, it benefits everyone else on the team as well. That's a really powerful and important function. Setting standards and all that stuff, making sure security stuff is addressed as well, that kind of becomes a nice core central function. And then you have basically your analysts are your customers. And so the more you can make those customers happy, I think the better off your team is.
Makes sense. I'm curious, Pedram, so you work with banks, and within banks, data governance is prevalent, hopefully, at least for the stick reason, right? They need to avoid those fines, but hopefully for other beneficial reasons as well, that they want to be a bit more data governance having a role in a startup in those early stages? From my experience, I don't really see startups really want to invest in that. They don't see the reason, and they do the best that they can of like putting some definitions together, making sure that from the onset they have a common understanding what a customer is. But obviously, that's also growing organically, and as the startup is growing within to a larger company, then all that gets lost and a lot of messiness is introduced. And at one point, then data governance comes in and says, okay, we got to start making sense of all of this. What is your experience telling you about the data governance role within startups?
I think, like you said, it's a stick, a legislative stick, a regulatory stick. And it's really hard to get people to do the right thing when it's like some abstract potential threat, but it's a very concrete threat when you are trying to like IPO and you need to have these things, or you want to get SOC 2 compliance and you have to have these things. So that's why those regulations exist, because we know people wouldn't do them if they didn't. So we had to build regulations to make sure these things are adhered to. Sometimes it can feel really heavy, especially at a startup when you have 27 other priorities and you're just trying to figure out, is my product worth selling? Regulatory risk is pretty far down. Like, you hope that's an issue that you have to deal with one day, right? The only time I've seen it work is like if you're in one of those industries where you have no choice. So if you're in banking, insurance, as like a startup, even like fintech, then hopefully not always, you tend to have a much more stronger regulatory mindset on these things. And then data governance tends to matter more because you're dealing with private information, like healthcare for sure. Like even startups tend to be very good at that. When it's just like B2B SaaS, B2C customers, I think it's you tack it on when you have to, when you realize, oh, GDPR, what is that? Okay, let's figure out how to make sure we adhere to it. Or we're trying to get a SOC 2 compliance report. Okay, no, not everyone can have access to the warehouse. We have to have access controls, all that stuff. So that's how I've seen it. I wish it's always easier to do it up front.
But to me, it's even... Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But I get you with having the restriction of resources that we talked earlier, and this is not as high of a priority. But so to me, it's also not just about the stick, but it's about the carrot part of the data governance. And in my opinion, it helps set the foundation for multiple things as well, including hopefully having good data quality that you're working with, and just having those policies, processes, procedures, the clear roles and responsibilities, all the definitions from the onset. It is beneficial in the long run as well, but I understand it takes quite a bit of effort to set all that up, and maybe the benefit is not seen right away because of it.
Yeah, I think so. I think if you've seen the benefit before, it's very easy to make that case for yourself and then move that case up. But if you've never been burned by bad data quality, then you don't really value data quality. It's like one of those things that you only care about once you've actually seen the impact. And it's the same with everything else, even with governance. If you've never felt the pain of bad governance because you've never had that issue before, then to you it might seem like governance, big deal, who cares? But if you have seen the pain of trying to bolt on governance to a very complex thing after the fact, you realize, oh, maybe I should just start. I've got a fresh data stack. It's a lot easier to bolt these things on now when there's very little cost to do it. But I think it takes the right mindset to see that, right?
And maybe a person who has gone through that process and knows how painful it is to do it afterwards.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Because you were talking about the carrot, but I think there's bigger carrots where other agency,
Yeah.
you know. Yes.
Yeah, like Pedram was saying, like you have to prove that your product or service is working, and that's the most important thing.
So I am very passionate about culture in general, and I believe the culture, although intangible, is really fueling the success of an organization. Our question today would be, how do you foster a data-driven culture within a startup? And how important are the leaders in establishing this data-driven culture?
Very important. And yeah, this is something I actually care a lot about too. It's tough because you don't want to get into a place where you're forcing people to look at data they don't want to, right? At the same time, you have to show value. I think it'd be really frustrating as a data person to go up to someone and say, oh, but the data says this, and then they don't care. And they're just like, no, my gut tells me I'm going to do this. That's actually probably fine for them to not look at the data. When you're at a startup and things are moving fast, like you might not even have that much data, right? A lot of your decisions are going to be based on talking to customers, which is like a qualitative data set, right? It's not something in your database, but you probably could talk to every single customer at an early stage startup, right? And that conversation is going to be much more valuable than what a spreadsheet tells you about when they signed up. So I think there's always going to be this like balance to strike between being data driven and like just relying on other signals that can help drive your company. But I think at some point you will realize that like this company needs data and we're operating in an inefficient way without it. Once you've hit that, I think you're in a sweet spot because now you can make a really good case. But you still have to make a really good case. And what I really like is like this idea of the weekly business review. It's just a way of bringing the leaders, like you need staff level people in a room looking at a set of numbers that we all agree are important and holding each business leader accountable to those metrics, not to like maybe goals even, but just to like talking through them. And that process, I think, is almost more valuable than the numbers themselves, but the process is driven by this data thing. So if I want to bring like a data driven culture to a startup, I think the first thing I would do is wait until it's like the right time. Usually I would say Series B is like the right time. Series A is almost too early. Like you might need some data to do a few things, but you don't need it to drive your business, to know your customers, to know how many signups you got. Like you're looking at that stuff every day because like your life is like on the line at a company. So you don't need like a weekly business review. You have that every single day. But once you get to Series B, I feel like there's enough people, there's enough like organizational barriers to knowing everything that something like a weekly business review can be super useful. And I would always start small, find core KPIs or key metrics, and bring people in a room to just like look at them. And what's going to happen inevitably is something will go up or down. People will want to know why. And that's when the data team really gets into play, right? And then they start to build more metrics, more theories on signups were down for the past 3 weeks. Why is that? Okay, let's go investigate. Next meeting, you'll have one more chart on that weekly business review that you can explore. And that's, I think the way you build a data culture is like just leading by example and building a place where people can ask questions.
Right.
Because if we think about like so many people lose sight of like data's goal, it's not to generate data, it's not to build a database, it's not to create pipelines. It's to help forecast and understand, right? Like you want to know the future and you want to know what happened in the past. Like that's what you want. And data is the vehicle with which we do that process, right? And so if we can build places for people to ask questions about what happened and to talk about where things are going, and we use data to drive that, then I think the data team can be super successful.
Beautifully said. Pedram, I'm curious, as you're scaling up the data team, are there different type of personal attributes that you're looking into the new hires that you wish them to, that they would have that's maybe different than those attributes at the early set of the startup when you're just forming that initial team? Is there a difference that you're noticing when you're looking at scaling that up, or it's consistent from the start?
I don't think so. I haven't scaled too far into the future, too far. So it's hard for me to say. But I don't think there'll be ever a day where I would want to hire somebody who's not curious about learning, I would say.
Right.
Maybe I would probably start to focus much more on business alignment. The first couple hires have to be general purpose, but if I'm looking for someone to help support the marketing team, I want really somebody like who's probably worked in marketing before, who understands marketing and like kind of gets the whole spiel. But other than that, I don't think so. I don't think it would change.
Got it.
Can you share some success stories from your experience, or maybe some lessons learned from scaling data teams at startups that you think people might be interested in and might learn from?
That's a good question. I think so. So at a previous company, it was a startup. And it was not, I don't think, data driven at all, right? It was a lot of new founders, and they were just like building the business and not focused on the data at all. So I think it was one offsite we had where I like begged for one session where I could spend 30 minutes to an hour just in a room talking to people and getting their opinions. And through that, I like basically forced them to come up with like a few metrics that they actually care about. And I think one of them was like just like something simple, like number of active workspaces or something like that. So a pretty standard, simple metric, but it was one that we all came and agreed upon, because like, it would have been easy for me to just go and make up a metric and say, we are all going to drive towards this now. But instead, I got people in a room and kind of talked to them around like, here's why I need a metric, right? Like I want to be able to say at the end of the day, like, what is the impact of all the things we're doing? But for me to say what the impact is, I want to know what we're trying to change. What are we trying to drive toward? Is it ARR? Is it revenue? Is it number of customers? Whatever it is, it's like fine by me, but let's get alignment on that. And so together we came up with this like weekly active workspaces metric. And it really helped align the organization, because now that we had that and it was like being reported on, I think every week, we all talked about that metric in terms of like all the things we wanted to do. Is it became that kind of North Star. So when the marketing team was doing ads, the way they judged the success of ads was weekly active workspaces. When we did events, when we did product changes, it was all to drive that one metric. It wasn't the only metric we looked at, but it really does help build organizational alignment, right? Because it's without it, it's tough. You're focused on like marketing and you're like, okay, well, created 10,000 ads. It's okay, but would they click on anything? Did they generate revenue? Did you just spend $10,000 on ads? It happened. And then another team will be like, oh, I know I changed a bunch of buttons on the website, and now our A/B test shows that like, these people clicked more on this one. It's like, okay, but like, how do I compare the work that they're doing to the work that they're doing? How do I know all is moving together? Finding that like, key metric that we're driving toward is, I think, a first step. It's not like a solution to all your problems, but it's one way to start to build that organizational alignment from the top down, where we can all agree on the one thing that we want to start to move, especially at a startup where like you need focus like all the time.
Right.
And that creates momentum, right? Because when people see the value, they will want more of it.
And it tells them what to work on too, right? It's like, oh, I have 3 projects, I could do this or that. That's the one that's going to drive this metric forward. I'll probably start with this one. Whereas without it, it's like, I'll do the one I think is best,
Yeah.
which might be okay, but it might like, if you have 3 ships going in 3 different directions, like we don't really know which way we're headed, right?
That's right.
Yeah, good analogy.
Thank you very much, Pedram, for today. Thank you for your insights. Thank you very much, everyone joining as well. Thank you for the work that you do, Pedram, and for investing in those startups that need this type of experience and expertise that you bring in. And have a great weekend.
All right. Thank you all. It was great talking to you.
Likewise. Bye, everybody.